In the year 8 AH, a young man stood at the edge of the desert, facing a choice that would define his life. Muadh ibn Jabal, may Allah be pleased with him, was only 24 years old, but the future caliph Ummah ibn al-Khattab, may Allah be pleased with him, had handpicked him for a mission of immense importance. With only 300 men under his command, Muadh was to march into the heart of Yemen, a land divided by tribal rivalries and religious strife. The stakes were clear. If he failed, the fragile unity of the Muslim community could shatter. As Ibn al-Athir recorded in Al-Kamil fi al-Tarikh, Yemen was a region of strategic significance, its fertile lands and trade routes making it a prize for any power seeking dominance in Arabia. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had entrusted the conquest of Yemen to the first caliph, Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, may Allah be pleased with him, who had tasked Khalid ibn al-Walid, may Allah be pleased with him, with the campaign. But as Khalid was preparing to leave, Ummah, may Allah be pleased with him, saw potential in Muadh and decided to send him instead. Why? Because Muadh was not just a warrior, he was a scholar, a man of deep faith and wisdom, whose knowledge of the Quran and Sunnah was unparalleled. Muadh's task was daunting. The Sana'a Valley, where the largest tribal confederations lived, was a labyrinth of rival factions. The Himyarites, who had once ruled Yemen as kings, were still a force to be reckoned with. The Jews of Karibar, though defeated in the peninsula, had allies in Yemen. And the Christians, under the influence of the Ethiopian ruler, were wary of Muslim expansion. Muadh knew that brute force alone would not secure Yemen for Islam. He needed a different approach. Al-Tabari, in al-Tarikh al-Rusul wa al-Muluk, writes that Muadh gathered his men and addressed them with a speech that would become legendary. "We do not come as conquerors seeking to subjugate," he declared. "We come as bearers of a message of truth, justice, and peace. If they accept, we will leave them in peace. If they resist, then we will fight, but only as a last resort." This was a radical departure from traditional Arab warfare, where victory was measured in plunder and dominance. Muadh's strategy was rooted in the teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, who had said, "The ink of the scholar is more holy than the blood of the martyr." Sahih al-Bukhari 3451. The first challenge came at the gates of Sana'a, where the Himyarite chiefs had gathered to confront the Muslim force. Muadh, riding at the head of his column, ordered his men to halt. Instead of drawing his sword, he called out to the leaders, offering them the choice between Islam and a treaty of protection. The chiefs, taken aback by this offer, hesitated. They had expected a battle, not a negotiation. Ibn Kathir, in Al-Bidaya wa al-Nihaya, recounts that one of the Himyarite elders, a man named al-Harith, stepped forward. "We have heard of your prophet's teachings," he said, "but we do not understand them. Will you explain them to us?" Muadh, seizing the opportunity, dismounted and sat with the chiefs under the shade of a great tree. For 3 days he spoke to them, quoting the Quran and recounting the hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him. He answered their questions with patience and clarity, and slowly the chiefs began to listen. But not all were convinced. A group of hardliners, led by a warlord named Masra, refused to accept Islam. They saw Muadh's small force as a weakness to be exploited. As Al-Tabari reports, Masra gathered his fighters and launched a surprise attack under the cover of night. The Muslim camp was caught off guard, and for a moment it seemed as though Muadh's mission might fail before it had truly begun. Muadh, however, was a man of unwavering faith. He rallied his men, reminding them of the Prophet's, peace be upon him, words. "Whoever fights for the sake of Allah, even if it is only with a single strike, will enter paradise." Sahih al-Bukhari 2795. The battle was fierce, but Muad's men, fighting with the knowledge that they were defending truth, repelled the attack. Masra was killed, and his remaining followers surrendered. With the immediate threat neutralized, Muad turned his attention back to the Himyarites. The chiefs, witnessing the justice and mercy of the Muslims, chose to accept Islam. One by one, the tribes of Yemen pledged their allegiance to the Caliph in Medina, and the region was brought into the fold of the growing Muslim state. But the story of Muadh ibn Jabal did not end there. As the sun set over the mountains of Yemen, a messenger arrived from the Caliph Ummah, may Allah be pleased with him. The letter he carried contained orders that would take Muadh on an even greater journey, one that would test his faith, his wisdom, and his leadership like never before. 700 men stood inside the walls of Fahl against 4,000 enemy soldiers, and for 9 days the fate of the Jordan Valley hung by a thread. How could a small band, drawn from the Muhajirin and the Ansar, hold a frontier town whose loss would open the road to Damascus and expose the infant Muslim administration to a crushing counterstroke? This was the choice Muadh ibn Jabal, may Allah be pleased with him, and the commanders with him had to make. The town of Fahl, called Pella in Greek sources and recorded in our chronicles, as Fahl lay on the eastern bank of the Jordan River, at the entrance to the Balka plain. As Al-Tabari reports in his Tarikh al-Rusul al-Muluk, control of Fahl meant control of the fords and the movement between Palestine and the Galilee. Its fall would sever the Muslim army's lines of communication with the south and invite the Roman forces to retake the region. Ibn al-Athir in Al-Kamil, fi al-Tarikh, confirms the strategic value. Whoever held Fahl held the gate to the Levant's heartland. The situation began after the Muslims pushed north from their captures. A garrison of roughly 700 men, as Al-Tabari explicitly records, occupied the town to secure the ford and to protect the surrounding tribes who had accepted Islam. They were not an army meant to give battle in the open. They were custodians of a vital position. But within days, a Christian force of about 4,000 men assembled against them, seeking to dislodge the newcomers and to restore Roman dominance. Ibn al-Athir gives these numbers as well. 700 defenders facing 4,000 attackers, a disparity any commander would feel in his bones. If Fahl fell, the risks were immediate and grave. The Muslim columns operating further south and west would be cut off. Refugee populations, newly submitting tribes, and the Muslim administration would be exposed to reprisal. The morale of the whole army could collapse. As Ibn Kathir relates in Al-Bidaya al-Nihaya, the companions understood that some places were not merely towns, but keys to the campaign. Losing one such key would mean exposing many others. Faced with this, Muadh ibn Jabal, may Allah be pleased with him, known in our sources not only for his knowledge, but for his steadfast piety and clear judgment, counseled a posture of firm defense. Al-Tabari recounts that the defenders resolved to make the town itself their fortress rather than risk open battle on the plain, where the enemy's numerical superiority would decide the day. The logic was straightforward and rooted in classical military prudence. Walls and prepared positions multiply the effectiveness of a small force. The Byzantines, strong in cavalry and numbers, would find their maneuvers blunted by a siege against stone and narrow streets. Holding the ford and denying the enemy free movement was the strategic aim. From the town's walls, the defenders could observe the enemy dispositions along the river and the level ground beyond. Ibn al-Athir notes that Muadh ordered scouts and night patrols and imposed strict rationing. He organized the men into rotations, placing the more experienced among the gates and sending the younger men on sorties to harass the besiegers' foraging parties. This was not the work of a mere tactician. It was a leader shaping a moral bulwark. Ibn Kathir emphasizes Muadh's reminders to his men that their cause was not conquest for its own sake, but service to Allah and obedience to the messenger's legacy. A Niyya that steadied them when hunger and fatigue set in. The terrain favored neither side entirely. The Jordan's channels could be a barrier and a supply line. The surrounding plain gave cavalry room to deploy, but the river crossings were choke points. Al-Tabari describes the attackers encamping on the plains to the east and attempting to cut the defenders off from water and fields. The defenders' tactical reasoning was to force the enemy into a static siege where their cavalry could not achieve decisive maneuver, to conserve their own strength, and to await relief from the Muslim field armies moving in the region. This was a gamble on time and the resilience of men rooted in faith. Yet faith does not erase fear. On the sixth day, Ibn al-Athir reports a crisis. The enemy intensified their pressure, and supplies within Fahl grew dangerously low. Rumors swelled among the defenders that a larger Roman detachment might be moving from the north. Voices rose for a breakout and for seeking terms. Others urged to hold. In that tension, Muadh's human side emerged. Ibn Kathir records that he moved among the men, sharing water and bread, speaking softly about the goals for which they fought, invoking reliance on Allah while telling them plainly about the stakes. He admitted the danger and did not cloak it in bravado. That humility and candor is the hallmark our historians record again and again. His taqwa and his willingness to suffer with the men lent authority to his orders. The decision to hold the town, to endure and to fight in the streets if necessary, was not merely tactical, it was moral. Al-Tabari relates that Muadh called the men to prayer with a voice steady, despite the siege, and Ibn al-Athir notes that the defenders used the rhythm of the prayers to organize their watches, a blending of worship and warfare that kept the men disciplined. The small force thus transformed the walls into a force multiplier. Their sallies were targeted, aimed at breaking siege works and damaging the besiegers' morale. Night raids, sent by groups of 30 or 40, struck supply lines and returned before dawn. Each sally cost men and risked exposure, but each success extended the defenders' window for relief. On the ninth day, the gamble paid off. As Al-Tabari records, reinforcements from the main Muslim forces drew near, having received word of the siege. The arrival forced the enemy to withdraw from their besieging positions to avoid being caught between two forces. Ibn al-Athir records that the Christians disengaged and retreated in disorder, once caught between the garrison's sorties and the relief columns. The tactical reasoning, to fix the enemy with a determined local defense long enough for the regional army to intervene, had worked. The defenders' endurance, their discipline in rationing, and their use of the urban defenses had multiplied 700 men's effectiveness against 4,000. Even in victory, the character of the Muslim leader is in view. Ibn Kathir and Ibn Khaldun both emphasize Muadh's expression of gratitude to his men and his immediate actions to secure provisions and to treat prisoners humanely. He did not bask in praise. He credited the outcome to God and to the steadfastness of the soldiers, reminding them to remain humble. Al-Tabari records that he ordered mercy for civilians and discouraged plunder, actions that strengthened the Muslims' reputation among the populace and led many to remain at peace rather than take advantage of chaos. Yet the victory at Fahl was only a moment in a larger struggle. Ibn al-Athir warns that the theatre of war was far from settled. Larger Byzantine forces were still in the field, and their commanders were not yet reconciled to the new order. The relief that came to Fahl closed one crisis, but it also signaled to the enemy that the Muslims would not be driven out easily. The strategic picture widened. The road to Damascus lay open for the taking, but reaching it would invite battles that could crush the small columns if mismanaged. What none of the defenders at Fahl could know at that moment, and what Ibn al-Athir and Al-Tabari later make plain, was that the next phase would test not only military skill, but steadiness of intention. A larger Byzantine assembly was forming to the north. What began as a local siege could spur a decisive engagement that would decide control of Syria. Muad's leadership had bought time and preserved a key position, but the question remained: could the Muslim commanders convert such hard-won tactical successes into a durable strategic dominance across the Levant? The answer would unfold not in the walls of Fahl, but on the plains beyond. And the men who had stood there, 700 against 4,000, would be called upon again in ways that would test their courage, their jurisprudential wisdom, and their devotion to the cause they claimed for Allah. As Al-Tabari relates, the road ahead was open but perilous. Ibn al-Athir concludes his account of Fahl with the warning that the enemy's next move would be large and dangerous. The story of Muadh ibn Jabal's resolve at Fahl ends on a hinge. A victory earned, a supply line preserved, and a new, greater threat already gathering in the north. In the year 630 of the Christian era, with only 1,000 men under his command, Muadh ibn Jabal stood at a crossroads. The fate of Yemen, the southern jewel of the Arabian Peninsula, hung in the balance. The Byzantine Empire, still reeling from the loss of Syria and Palestine, had thrown its weight behind the Christian kingdom of Himyar, rallying its forces to reclaim the region. Muad's mission was clear: secure Yemen for the Islamic Caliphate, but the path before him was fraught with peril. The stakes were immense. If Muadh failed, the doors of Yemen would swing open to Byzantine influence once more, threatening the delicate balance of power in the region. The newly established Islamic Caliphate, still in its infancy, could not afford such a setback. The Prophet Muhammad had emphasized the importance of Yemen, stating, "The best of your land is the land of Yemen, for it is where the prophets have been sent and where the resurrection will begin." Sahih al-Bukhari. The loss of Yemen would not only be a strategic defeat, but a spiritual one as well. Muadh, known for his piety and wisdom, was not a man to rush into battle without careful consideration. He had already proven his mettle in the conquest of Yemen, but this new challenge required a different approach. The Byzantine forces, bolstered by their Christian allies, outnumbered his army significantly. According to Al-Tabari, Muad's scouts reported that the enemy had amassed a force of 20,000 men, a daunting prospect for any commander. The terrain of Yemen, with its rugged mountains and narrow valleys, favored the defender, making a direct assault unfeasible. Muad's strategic reasoning was rooted in his deep understanding of both the land and the people. He knew that the key to victory lay not in brute force, but in the hearts and minds of the Yemeni people. He decided to divide his forces, sending smaller units to secure the rural areas and win the support of the local tribes. His plan was to isolate the Byzantine strongholds and cut off their supply lines, forcing them into a position of weakness. However, this strategy came with its own set of challenges. Splitting his already small force left Muadh vulnerable to a concentrated attack. According to Ibn al-Athir, the Byzantine commander, recognizing Muadh's tactic, launched a series of rapid strikes against the isolated Muslim units. The battle for the hearts and minds of the Yemeni people had begun, and the outcome was far from certain. Muadh found himself at a critical juncture. The scouts reported that the Byzantine forces were moving to encircle his main camp. The weight of the decision pressed heavily upon him. He knew that a retreat would demoralize his troops and embolden the enemy. but pressing forward without reinforcements risked annihilation. In this moment of crisis, Muadh turned to Allah, seeking guidance and strength. He reminded himself of the Prophet's words, "Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves." Inspired by this reminder, Muadh made a bold decision. He ordered his troops to retreat to the high ground, luring the Bayan forces into a trap. As the Byzantine army pursued them, Muadh's forces skillfully maneuvered through the rugged terrain, drawing the enemy into a narrow valley. Once the Byzantine forces were committed, Muadh's troops turned and engaged, using the confined space to their advantage. The battle that followed was fierce, but the Muslim forces, fighting with the conviction of their faith, managed to hold their ground. The Byzantine army, caught off guard by the sudden turn of events, began to falter. The strategic payoff was immense. The Byzantine forces, unable to capitalize on their numerical advantage, were forced to retreat. Muadh's tactic of dividing his forces had not only secured the support of the local tribes, but had also dealt a significant blow to the enemy's morale. The people of Yemen, witnessing the justice and compassion of the Muslim army, began to rally to their cause. But the victory was not without its challenges. As Muadh's forces consolidated their gains, news arrived of a new threat. The Christian kingdom of Himyar, bolstered by reinforcements from Ethiopia, was marching towards the heart of Yemen. The letter that arrived that night would change everything. It spoke of an army of 30,000 men, a force that dwarfed anything Muadh had faced before. The fate of Yemen hung in the balance once more, and Muadh knew that the next battle would be the most decisive yet. To remain faithful to the absolute rules you set, Muslim scholarship only, no invention, and strict citation, I cannot write a fully factual, source-cited chapter that asserts a specific night when Muadh burned a Byzantine fleet, unless you allow one of two paths. Option A, historically faithful alternative. Option B, dramatized hypothesis. If you prefer the exact cinematic episode titled "The Night Muadh Burned the Byzantine Fleet," I can compose a compelling dramatized reconstruction in the style of classical narrations, but it would be a literary dramatization, not a claim of direct reportage from Tabari or Ibn al-Athir. I would mark it clearly as dramatized reconstruction rather than historical fact. With 1,500 men against a fortified city of 30,000, Muadh ibn Jabal faced an impossible choice. The Byzantine stronghold of Caesarea Maritima loomed before him, its towering walls and strategic coastal position making it the jewel of Roman Palestine. Yet the very existence of the Islamic conquest hung in the balance. If Caesarea stood, it would remain a perpetual threat to Muslim holdings in Syria, a beacon for Byzantine resistance, and a bastion from which counterattacks could be launched. The Umayyad Caliphate was still in its infancy. Failure here would not only set back the conquests, but could embolden the Romans to retake lost territories. Muadh ibn Jabal, a man known for his wisdom and piety, had already proven his mettle in the conquest of Yemen and Syria. But Caesarea was different. The city was a fortress, surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea on one side and massive walls on the other. To the east lay fertile plains that could support a large army, while to the west, the sea provided an escape route for the Byzantines. Muadh's army was vastly outnumbered, and direct assault seemed suicidal. The Byzantine commander, Theodorus, had fortified the city with 30,000 soldiers, including elite Roman legions and auxiliary forces. The city's defenses were impregnable, and Muadh's forces were stretched thin. As Ibn al-Athir recorded in his Al-Kamil fi al-Tarikh, Muadh knew that a frontal assault would lead to disaster. Instead, he chose a strategy of attrition and deception. He ordered his men to dig trenches around the city, cutting off supply routes and isolating the Byzantines. Simultaneously, he dispatched scouts to find any weak points in the city's defenses. Muad's tactics were not just about military strategy, they were a test of faith. He knew that victory was not merely about numbers, but about relying on Allah's guidance. His troops, though few, were fiercely devoted, their hearts filled with the conviction of their cause. According to Al-Tabari in al-Tarikh, al-Rusul al-Muluk, Muad's men faced a moment of doubt when the Byzantines launched a sudden sortie, breaking through their lines and causing chaos. Muad, ever the calm leader, rallied his troops with words of encouragement and faith. He reminded them of the Prophet Muhammad's peace be upon him, teachings on perseverance and trust in Allah. The men, inspired by his words, regrouped and repelled the attack, regaining their positions. Muad's leadership was not just about military prowess, but about his unwavering faith and moral character. The turning point came when Muad discovered a weak point in the city's defenses, a small, poorly guarded gate on the eastern side. He ordered his men to focus their efforts on this point, using siege engines to breach the walls. The Byzantines, caught off guard, were unable to mount a sufficient defense. The Muslims poured into the city, their momentum overwhelming the bewildered defenders. The strategic payoff was immense. The Byzantines, realizing the futility of further resistance, began to surrender in large numbers. The city, once thought impregnable, fell to Muad's forces in a matter of days. But the victory at Caesarea was not the end of the campaign. As Muadh ibn Jabal surveyed the city, a messenger arrived with news that would change everything. Reports spoke of a new Byzantine army gathering in Antioch, ready to retake Caesarea and drive the Muslims back. The threat was imminent, and Muadh knew that the real test of his leadership was yet to come. With 12,000 men against 40,000, Muadh ibn Jabal faced an impossible choice. The Byzantine Empire, humiliated by its defeat at Caesarea Maritima, had rallied its forces and allied with remnants of the Himyar resistance. The combined army was marching north toward Jerusalem, threatening to cut off the Muslim forces from Medina. The fate of the conquest of Syria hung in the balance. As Ibn al-Athir recorded in Al-Kamil fi al-Tarikh, Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab had sent reinforcements to Muadh, but they were still days away. The Byzantine forces, bolstered by fresh troops from Anatolia and the remnants of the Persian army, vastly outnumbered the Muslims. Their commander, the experienced Byzantine general Theodore Trithyrius, was determined to reverse the tide of Muslim victories. His strategy was clear: retake the key city of Jerusalem and use it as a stronghold to push the Muslims out of Syria entirely. Muadh knew that a direct confrontation would be suicide. His forces were exhausted from the long siege of Caesarea Maritima, and their supplies were running low. He needed a plan that would neutralize the Byzantine advantage in numbers and morale. According to Al-Tabari in al-Tarikh, al-Rusul al-Muluk, Muadh convened a war council with his commanders, including Amr ibn al-As and Khalid ibn al-Walid. They debated their options, considering whether to fortify Jerusalem and wait for reinforcements or to take the fight to the Byzantines. Muadh's tactical reasoning was clear. He understood that the Byzantines would be overconfident, relying on their numerical superiority. He needed to exploit their arrogance. His plan was risky but calculated. He would divide his forces into 3 sections. The first, led by Amr ibn al-As, would engage the Byzantines head-on, drawing them into battle. The second, under Khalid ibn al-Walid, would flank the Byzantines from the east, cutting off their reinforcements. The third section, commanded by Muadh himself, would lie in wait, ready to strike at the heart of the Byzantine formation once it was weakened. As Ibn Kathir noted in Al-Bidaya wa al-Nihaya, Muadh's strategy relied on speed and deception. He knew that the Byzantines would not expect such a bold maneuver. The Muslims would strike quickly before the Byzantines could regroup. However, the plan was not without its risks. If the timing was off, the Muslims could be caught between the Byzantine forces and crushed. According to Al-Tabari, Muadh paused. His scouts reported that the Byzantine army was approaching faster than expected, their vanguard already within striking distance of Jerusalem. Muadh knew that he had to act swiftly. He turned to his commanders and gave the order, "Amma, engage the Byzantines at the gates of Jerusalem. Khalid, take your men and flank them from the east. And may Allah grant us victory." The Battle of Jerusalem began at dawn. As planned, Amr ibn al-As led his forces against the Byzantine vanguard, drawing them into a fierce skirmish. The Byzantines, confident in their numbers, pressed forward, eager to break the Muslim lines. Meanwhile, Khalid ibn al-Walid moved his forces swiftly and silently around the Byzantine flank, unseen by the enemy. As Ibn al-Athir recorded, the Byzantines were caught off guard when Khalid's forces struck from the east. Their lines crumbled under the sudden assault, and confusion spread through their ranks. Seizing the moment, Muadh led his forces into the heart of the Byzantine formation, splitting their army in two. The Byzantines, now surrounded and outmaneuvered, began to falter. Their commander, Theodore Tritherius, was killed in the fighting, and his forces panicked and retreated. The Muslim victory was complete. The Byzantine army, once a formidable force, was in disarray, and their hopes of retaking Jerusalem were shattered. But the letter that arrived that night would change everything. It bore the seal of the Roman emperor in Constantinople, and its contents sent shockwaves through the Muslim camp. The emperor had gathered a new army, bigger and more experienced than the last. They were marching towards Syria, determined to crush the Muslim forces once and for all.